and welcome to the AAMFT podcast, your all-access pass to the latest news, developments, and thought leaders in the world of systemic therapy. We strive to relate, educate, and innovate, one episode at a time. I'm your host, Dr. Eli Karam, and we're brought to you by the American Association for Marriage and Family Therapy. Our podcast explores topics that relationship-based therapists care about. In addition to featuring unique conversations and interviews with established experts, our show provides information and education on direct practice and emerging trends in the MFT profession. For more information, please visit us at aamft.org. Thanks for listening and enjoy the show. Polyamory, meaning many loves, can be defined as the practice of having or pursuing multiple romantic relationships with the knowledge and consent of all parties involved. This falls into the category of ethical non-monogamy and is becoming increasingly recognized as a relationship style, although monogamy is still the norm in many cultures. So polyamory is in the news, it's in the movies, in the therapy room, and today it's on the AAMFT podcast, because as media attention grows for this open relationship style, more people are giving it a try and more clients are coming into our therapy rooms with these questions. So in today's episode of the AAMFT podcast, I sit down with LMFT Martha Kauppi to provide an introduction to polyamory from a systemic therapist perspective. Martha is a therapist, author, speaker, and educator specializing in complex sex issues and alternate family structures. She trains therapists all over the world, is the author of the groundbreaking book, Polyamory, a clinical toolkit for therapists and their clients. And we're going to talk a lot about that today. I learned so much talking to Martha. She is also the founder of the Institute for Relational Intimacy. She practices out of Madison, Wisconsin, but trains therapists face-to-face and virtually all over the world. And she gave me so much information that helped me, including terminology I think that every systemic couple therapist should know as they begin to learn and work with polyamorous family systems. We will be back after the interview. For us therapists burdened by manual note-taking, Blueprint's AI Note Taker offers a solution. It listens, transcribes, and automatically writes progress notes, freeing up to 5 hours of your time a week. This extra time can be used for client care or self-care. Join the thousands of therapists already using Blueprint and start your free trial at joinblueprint.com/MFT. That's joinblueprint.com/MFT, or simply search for Blueprint AI Note Taker. Eli, back on the AAMFT podcast. Martha, it is great to have you on. This is one of our most requested topics as far as polyamory in the context of how would you work with that in a systemic therapy, whether you're working with an individual, a couple, or more than a couple. First question is always, we're interested in our expert in both their therapeutic origin story and not only their journey into systemic therapy, but how did you get an interest in working with polyamorous client systems?
First of all, thank you so much for having me. I'm delighted to be here. And I love talking about polyamory and how to work with it because it's something that most people don't get much training in, and it feels scary to a lot of therapists. I'm really excited for the opportunity to just talk about it a little bit, clear up some mystery maybe, and help people get a little stronger traction. So I was raised in a fairly non-traditional family myself. My parents had what I would describe as a monogamish relationship, which meant that when my stepfather traveled, I knew that they had an agreement that he could connect with other partners when he was abroad.
How old were you when you made that discovery?
I don't know. It was just part of the agreements that I was aware of in our family system. My biological father died when I was 6. So my stepfather didn't come on the scene really until I was 7.5 or so. So probably I was in middle school or something when I was aware of this. And he was traveling a lot. And my brother also was aware of this. Neither one of us has any idea if he ever acted on it, but we both were aware that this was part of their agreement. I have no idea how that came up or what the context was. I was just little. But so I really grew up thinking, okay, a couple can decide what they want their relationship to look like. And I think there are a lot of people who don't have that context in their background in terms of an underlying belief system. Like some people think that the rules of their marriage are governed by God or the church or cultural norms or whatever. But in my family, it was abundantly clear that my parents made their decisions about what they wanted their relationship to look like. And then when my brother and I got a little older and started dating, pretty soon it became clear that my brother was not monogamous. And he really always had more than one relationship and eventually got married and was in a polyamorous relationship, like basically for his whole adult life. It was clear to me that this was feasible. He was in an 18-year long relationship and his wife died of cancer at 18 years into their marriage. So a very strong relationship. No reason to think it ever would have ended. And then I went to graduate school in marriage and family therapy. And I had a terrific couples therapy professor. And I said, so what about polyamorous relationships? How does this apply? And he said, I have worked with some people in polyamorous relationships, and it seems like one partner or the other has a parent with a personality disorder. And I just thought, first of all, sounds a little marginalizing.
A little pathologizing, which we don't like to do as MFT systemic thinkers.
Yeah, exactly. A little pathologizing. And also I was like, okay, did my mom have a personality disorder? Like maybe, but do I think that's relevant? And then I started looking at what was written about polyamory. And I was reading things like true intimacy can only happen in a monogamous relationship. I thought about my brother's marriage and I thought, yeah, I don't agree with that. Like they have deep intimacy. They have deep trust and then might work in the short run, but it can't possibly last. But I don't know. 18 years and going strong is a pretty good track record. I don't think I believe that either. And when it was time for me to choose a research subject for my master's program, I decided to research polyamorous relationships, specifically looking at intimacy and longevity because those were such prevalent myths. So that's how that all unfolded for me.
Since you brought up research, let's start with that because I feel like there's a dearth of research and certainly your experience mimics mine. I was trained 24 years ago and I don't think anybody at a great institution of higher learning for MFT, I don't think anybody mentioned polyamorous relationships. So the idea that you really are a groundbreaker in this area, both in your research and your clinical work, but what does the research tell us about this population that's clinically relevant for our listeners?
Really good question. First of all, just because you have multiple relationships doesn't mean that you have a personality disorder. That's clearly established in the literature. There's no psychopathology that's associated with consensual non-monogamy of any kind. That doesn't mean that there's never somebody who's in a CNM relationship that has psychopathology. Of course, those things can co-occur, but they're not related. And there's not a higher degree of pathology in the population of people in open relationships than there is in the general population. It's not about pathology. It's not about an attachment wound. It's not about, or at least we can't assume that it is. Everybody's an individual, but there's no reason to look for psychopathology as a causation. Also, why would you? It's actually a workable form of relationship. You'd only be concerned about how it happened if it was maladaptive, right? And It's not maladaptive. It works great when it works. It doesn't work for everybody. And I could say the same about monogamy. Monogamy works great for some people. Other people have real difficulty with it. Those are the people who are in my office, in your office. And this is the problem for therapists who don't get any training in this area. The sample that you're looking at is the sample that's struggling. You're not seeing the people in your office who have long-term relationships that are going.
That's what I always tell my students too. There's a section of the population that chooses this lifestyle that we talk about today that have good rules, boundaries, and they don't need the benefit. It's usually we see that couples come in when there are problems, but you're right. There's no need to pathologize this population more than any other configuration or different constellation of couple that an MFT may see.
So let me just riff off of that for a second, because I think that's such an important point. The first and most important thing, if you're going to work with this population, or I would say any marginalized population, is you have to be clear within yourself that the relationship shape itself is not the problem. There's some other problem. There's a relational problem. Imagine if for every monogamous couple that you see that comes into couples therapy, you were thinking, gee, I wonder if monogamy is the problem here. If you float that out to every single person in their first session, they're just going to be like, F you, and that will be the end of it. So I think it's really important to be aware this is a workable relationship form. I don't know if it's going to work for you. I don't know if it's going to work for the couple in front of me. I don't know what they're going to decide. In a way, it's none of my business what they decide. But attending to the process of what's going on between them and the interactional sequences and the systemic dynamics would be the work that you're there to do, not questioning their choice about how they're forming their relationship.
Polyamorous couples will sometimes spend a lot of time interviewing the therapist ahead of time to make sure the right fit. I know when I've worked with couples like this and they say, are you comfortable? I'm like, yes, I said, because I'm generally a curious guy. And as my general rules is, even if it doesn't float my boat in my personal life, as long as it does no harm, it is safe and consensual, then it can work. So I think that is the ideology a therapist has to have, especially one that may not have the family of origin experience you had or done the research you do. They have to assess for safety and consensuality.
Yeah. And when you talk about consent in that context, absolutely, that's important. And consent is part of the definition of polyamory and consensual non-monogamies of any kind. And also, it's very possible to see somebody who is not in a consensual situation right now. And that's true if it's monogamy, if it's CNM, if it's polyamory, it doesn't matter what. We often will see somebody who doesn't have consent in their relationship. So it's not like it's a factor that predetermines treatment. It's just a thing to be aware of. If there's not consent in place, you have some idea of at least one treatment direction available. What do you want to do about this consent piece? But it's not like you would say, oh, because all partners aren't consenting here, I won't see you any more than if you were, would you turn away somebody who was having an affair that their partner didn't know about?
Absolutely.
I think
you'd have a structured way of working with it, and you would need to know that. And you would, most couples are come to us because they lack structure or a way to repair. So you'd have to have a credible way of doing that. But no, certainly you wouldn't turn anyone away.
People who generally are happy with their relationships, happy with their sex lives, they are generally very self-aware and interested in personal growth, which is so interesting. I definitely have observed that in my client pool. These are people who are interested in relationships, and they're interested in the personal growth opportunities that come along with relationships, which is terrific because they're going to have some personal growth opportunities as a result of their relationships. And the thing that's cool about this is it really makes them my ideal client, because I love somebody who's motivated to grow and who's interested in developing further insight and relational capacity. That's my jam. I like that much better than somebody with a history of multiple infidelities with a pattern of lies and deception and no intention of changing it. So which points to the other thing I love about working with this population, they have at least an aspiration of transparency in their relationships. And I super duper love that. It's so aligned with my values. This is a great population to work with for so many reasons. They're also generally sexually literate. They are probably aware of safer sex practices and concerned about sexual health and other kinds of health. All of that is in the literature. And over the years, there's more and more research to the point now where there's starting to be enough research to be able to really say a lot of this with confidence and not just from my clinical experience working with many people in open relationships.
We've been using the terms polyamory and ethical or consensual non-monogamy. We've been using both of those terms. Are they the same or are they different?
A little bit different. Consensual non-monogamy is a term that's an umbrella over all consensual non-monogamies. I think it's essentially synonymous with ethical non-monogamy. And you could Google up a nice battle about which is better, consensual or ethical, whatever. I just go with consensual. So that is an umbrella over any form of open relationship that's consensual. So that might encompass swinging. It might encompass friends with benefits. It might encompass monogamish. So something that is mostly monogamous, but with a friends with benefits thing, or when you travel abroad, you can hook up thing or something like that. And it also encompasses polyamory. And the definition of polyamory is a consensually open relationship that probably involves romance. So there's going to be like love feelings coming up expected. Open, it usually refers to a form of an open relationship where you don't expect romance to come up. And CNM is the umbrella for all of it.
Wonderful. It's very helpful for our listeners. Is there any other lexicon or terminology that's important? I remember before I started working with these couples several years back, I was introduced to the term hinge. I'm wondering, you can define that for us, and also any other terminology that you think would be important for a clinician wanting to know more about this population and working with polyamorous couples.
Sure. First, going broad with that question, there's a lot of particular language for this population, generally developed by this population to describe them. And it changes all the time, and it's a little different regionally over time until things gel. If when in doubt, Google it. And when in doubt, how it expresses for your client, just ask. Just say, what does that look like in your life? And don't hesitate to ask because, geez, what one person's monogamy looks is different than what another person's monogamy looks like. So why wouldn't that be the same for a consensually non-monogamous situation? That said, yes, there's a whole glossary of terms. I really tend, to a certain degree, to not think that knowing all the terms is the most important thing. Using your clinical intuition and ability to join is much more important than knowing a particular vocabulary. But a polycule is a group of people who are connected in some way by usually polyamory. And a V is a very common relationship shape. So that's a situation where one person has two relationships, and the person who has two relationships is referred to as a hinge. There might be a primary and a secondary partner, or it might be non-hierarchical. So if there's a primary and a secondary structure, then there's a little power difference between the primary and the secondary partner or partners. The relationship between the partners, the other partners, primary, secondary, or non-hierarchical, is metamor. Let's see how I can describe this. Two people who are involved with the same person are one another's metamors. If Jill and Jane are involved with Judy, Jill and Jane are metamors to one another. Judy is the hinge. Let's see. What other words? I think compersion is an important one. Compersion is a word for, I would say, the opposite of jealousy. And this is why it's important, because jealousy comes up all the time in non-monogamous relationships and in the therapy around it. Compersion is feeling happy and fulfilled and genuinely glad that your partner is having a good time with somebody else. And it's interesting because some people are like down with compersion. I don't even believe in compersion, which is fine, but this is a muscle you can build in ways that are not so much about sexual relationships. If you think about, I'm going to guess dozens of clients you've worked with who've talked to you about how depressing they find Facebook to be or other social media because everybody's smiling and happy and they've got people over and they've got these beautiful lives and they're going these beautiful places and their families are so beautiful and perfect. Looking at somebody else's success and then feeling happy for them is something we can practice instead of feeling jealous of them or bad about yourself as a result of it or whatever. So you can actually practice the muscle that's underneath compersion with social media by challenging yourself to see those pictures and be like, yay, you. That's awesome that you got to take that family vacation instead of, oh, I'm such a piece of crap because I can't afford it and I'm alone and I feel bad about myself and I feel bad about you and all that. So that's compersion. Compersion is feeling good about your partner being happy with somebody else, right? And an example of compersion is I had a client who was scared to tell her partner that her new partner, other partner, secondary partner had said that they loved her. And she was scared to reveal this to her partner because she thought it would make her partner jealous. And yet, because she was nervous about disclosing that, she knew it was important to disclose, important for her and possibly important for her partner. So she did disclose it. And what her partner says, I would hope so. Your partner had better love you. Otherwise, what the hell are they doing with you? And I thought that was very beautiful. Really showed putting yourself in someone else's shoes and wanting their greatest good and celebrating their successes instead of collapsing or sinking into a negative place as a result of it.
Now, thinking of our audience of therapists, I have seen couples like this present in a few different ways. So I'll tell you in my non-expertise opinion how these present and maybe you can add. So probably the most common and what I've seen in the therapist supervises where a polyamorous couple has had previous rules of engagement, so to speak, or an agreement, and then the agreement has been violated, a breach of trust. I've also seen couples, sometimes they're early in the relationship, sometimes they're well into the relationship or even married, where they are discussing the pros and cons of having a polyamorous relationship. They have not started it yet, but they're coming in to get a third party, the systemic therapist opinion on that. And I imagine this happens, especially for you, as you're known for this, but I have never had a polycule present, but I'm really interested in what would that look like, the whole system, so to speak, present for therapy. So your thoughts on those three different types of presentation?
When I teach about this, I like to go in order of the challenges that you're going to encounter so that you're prepared for what's coming. And the first challenge that happens is you have to decide who you're going to involve in the first phase of treatment. And if you have one person calling you and saying, I want to come in and talk about my feelings about my decision or my challenges with my polyamorous relationship, individual therapy, no problem. You know who your client is. It's an individual, and you know that their course of work is going to involve relational skills, but it's an individual therapy. Or maybe you have a couple who calls you, or one partner of a couple that wants to bring their partner, one partner, do some couples work around opening up, whether it be about broken agreements, about jealousy, challenges with polyamory. Do we want to open up? How do we make a repair? Whatever it may be. But it's a couple, and nobody is suggesting bringing in another person. Then you have a couples therapy with relational work. Things get a little trickier when your prospective client wants to bring multiple partners in. Then you have to make a decision. I think my strong opinion is you should make a decision as a leader of this course of treatment, who you want to have, especially at your first session. But I think of this kind of in treatment phases: first session, early treatment, mid-treatment, late treatment. And who I want, especially in the first session and early treatment, is the decision-making body for the relationship in question. If it's an individual, no problem. We've got one person and we can do individual work, or we can do relational work with only one person in the room, or we could decide to invite a partner as a guest if that became useful at some point in the future. I think that the tricky thing is usually there's a problem in the decision-making body. Not always, but usually. And if there's a problem in the decision-making structure of things, like we're not sure what our agreements are, or we're in a primary relationship, but this secondary relationship is causing us a huge amount of strife and difficulty. So we want to bring all of us in. I would say, not so fast. Let's start with the decision-making body. So if you have a primary, secondary structure in your relationship, you have a dyad who's making decisions. And let's start there and get the foundation here between the two of you ironed out in terms of clarity about what decisions you have made and are making for your relationship moving forward, because that's the foundation I would need to be able to do a good job when another partner or partners come into the work.
What about your tips for if it's a couple that want to enter into the lifestyle but never have? So it is a couple, they're coming with their own ideas, but they've talked about it enough that they want to talk about it with a therapist. How would you treat a case like that?
Oh, I love that case. That is not a common case. Usually you get somebody a couple or 3 years down the line with some broken agreements and some problems, and you don't get them before they actually act on the opening up. So when I'm lucky enough to have that client, first of all, it's surprising how many people have zero resources. They don't have any friends that are in open relationships. Maybe they talked to one guy at a party and they've never read a book. And I wrote a book, so I have a good book that covers a whole lot of ground. It's not the only book about polyamory either. First, I would strongly recommend that they actually do a little reading. I would recommend that they get in touch with some people who are in open relationships. And there are some meetup groups that are good bets for that. So looking for a meetup group like Poly Cocktails or something like that would be a good idea, because then they could have conversations with people who are in open relationships. And then I want to ask them some questions like, what are you hoping to get to? If this therapy goes well, where will you be in 3 months or 6 months? And get a sense of where we're trying to head and whether the people in my office are in accord regarding the direction they want to go. If they're not in accord, that's okay. That happens all the time. But then I want to know what's important to each one of them. And if they are in a kind of a gridlock, I want to open up, I don't want to open up, then I would try to take it broader than the specific circumstance of open or closed and ask, what do you want to experience in your relationship that you think you're going to experience if you're open, or that you think you're going to experience if you're monogamous? What are you trying to avoid that you think you're going to experience in the one that worries you? So that we're talking about felt experience rather than circumstance. We have a real tendency to think that our circumstances create our experience. But there are actually a lot of different ways to create an experience. And when you feel empowered to create an experience, regardless of circumstance, things really start to move a lot. For instance, to use an example, a typical scenario might be, I want to open up because I want to feel free. I want to feel some autonomy. I like spending time with multiple different kinds of people in different kinds of ways. And I really like sexual adventure. That would be fairly classic. And then let's imagine a more monogamy leaning partner might say, I'm not a sexual adventurer. And so I don't have very much interest in sexual adventure. I really like stability. I like security. I do like adventure generally, but not in this way. I enjoy time alone. I enjoy time with maybe you, my partner, maybe my closest friends, but I'm not looking to go out and party every night or whatever. So I'm thinking cozy, homey. That's one way that this might look, certainly not the only way. So then at least we're talking about experiences, and we can talk about how could you get cozy, homey, stable, and secure in an open relationship? How could you get adventure, novelty, freedom, and not feeling trapped in a monogamous relationship, right? And then we can start getting out of the gridlock and into a more kind of generative, creative space.
Another question we get a lot is, how can the MFT help a couple solidifying these rules or strong agreements around the polyamory, which is important for these couples, like we were talking about, that all of us would like to see, that haven't entered in the lifestyle yet or thinking about it, but is also essential in repairing trust after there has been either a break of the rules or a lack of clarity in the rules. And that's where, as we said, most of these couples will find in MFT. What are your thoughts on making strong rules and agreements around the polyamorous activity?
I have many thoughts about this, and some of them go a little against, I think, a couple therapists' impulse. So I think that differentiation is very important, and I'm going to define it. So this obviously came from Bowen originally, but the way that I define it is 3 aspects. The first is the ability to check in with yourself and figure out what you think and feel and prefer, separate from what anybody else might want for you or from you. Just me. Can I find my center and figure out what I want? And then the second one is to get grounded enough to be able to share that with somebody else, even if you think that it's going to be hard for them to hear. So no matter what pushback you're going to get, can you represent yourself? Which might include sticking with it over time, right? And then the third one is being able to get grounded enough to lean in with genuine curiosity when somebody else is sharing something that's hard for you to hear. What's that about for you? How does that get under your skin? What are you afraid of? What lights you up about that? Walk me through it, show it to me, paint me a picture so that I can feel it through my empathy and my caring for you. Walk me through it. Let me walk in your shoes. Paint me a picture of what you're imagining or experiencing. Those 3 things add up to a very complex suite of relational skills. And if we focus only on attachment, we seriously miss the boat here with differentiation. So I think that it's more of a both and situation. I think that mending attachment wounds and getting security in an attachment relationship is the foundation we need to be able to effectively differentiate. But if we forget why we would mend those attachment wounds is so that we can function well relationally. If we forget that, we just stop in safety and security. And safety and security is not particularly hot. Over time, it tends to go flat, become boring, lead to resentment. Okay. So that's a foundational piece of understanding that goes under what I'm going to say about agreement making. I think people tend to make agreements from a conflict avoidant place, by which I mean, how often have you seen a client say, oh, can't we just stop talking about this? Okay, I'll do it. I'll do it for you. Or I've never been able to do that before, but I am sure that I can do it this time because I really want to, because I love you so much. And of course I want to do this. Yes, I agree to that. I would say both of those are very shaky agreements, lacking in differentiation. So what I would much rather hear in my office, which is hard to hear, don't get me wrong, but much more honest would be, I don't know. I've never actually been able to do that before. So my sense is, yes, I'd like to, but I hesitate to just say for sure it's going to happen because I might be missing something here about what it takes. That would be a terrific start. Or I'm exhausted and flooded by this conversation. I would like to stop talking about it. I need a break. We can come back to it and talk about it again. But what I want you to understand, my darling, is that I'm not in agreement with you about this. We're going to have to get to someplace else before I'm going to feel comfortable agreeing. At the moment, we do not have an agreement. A whole lot of people do not want to say that to their best beloved. And as a therapist, it's a tense situation when an impasse opens up in our office. And yet, if an impasse doesn't open up when it should have, then we've been co-opted into the system and there's going to be a broken agreement down the road. Did that make sense?
Oh, you said it beautifully. It's hard to imagine an undifferentiated person being successful in a polyamorous relationship. So yeah, it's great if you can catch that before the agreement is made. So let's say that you get a couple midstream where the partner's like, okay, I thought I knew what I was getting into, but I didn't. We need to change the agreement, or there has been a deliberate breach of trust to the agreement. How would you handle a couple like that?
I'd be interested to know what exactly happened with that agreement. And I'd like to know what each partner has learned about themselves and each other from the breach. Because what I'm going for is the differentiation. I'm going for, can you learn what's going on for yourself from what's happening? So the choices that you made should teach you something about what you do and don't want. And the choices that your partner made should teach you something about what they do and don't want. And now could we start using our words to express that stuff instead of using our behaviors to express it? And I want to say something about the necessity of differentiation in an open relationship. Differentiation is not something where you get there and then you check the box. It's more of a lifelong journey. It's a developmental process that evolves ever deeper over time. And it's something that developmentally happens around separation. It's really about holding self and other respectfully and not giving up yourself and also not giving up your connection to somebody else. So be warm with somebody even when you're disagreeing with them. Can you stay connected while you're in tension? And you can start to see we're never going to be perfect at that. It's going to be ever evolving. Some people ask me, do you think a certain level of differentiation is a prerequisite for well-functioning polyamory? And I would say, wouldn't you say that a certain level of differentiation is awfully helpful for, let's say, consensual sex? It's the same skill set. You have to be able to figure out what you want. You have to be able to represent yourself under tension in the moment. Say yes, no, back up, pivot, respect somebody else's pivot, even when you're feeling panicky. And yet, we do tend to get into sexual relationships long before we have that skill set. And that's how we build the skill set. Life presents us with growth opportunities, and that helps us have a reason to grow and move forward. The fact that your client is not already at a high level of differentiation is not a bad sign. It just tells you where some focus needs to happen.
It's interesting. Mary Bowen said that people meet up at the same level of differentiation. They may look different on the outside, but in the inside, they're very similar. And I think in my experience, in my own long-term marriage and in the couples I've worked with for the last 24 years, I think he had no data to support that. It was his clinical wisdom, but I think it's pretty true. You mentioned in the sexual relationship, obviously you're building on the work of the late great David Snarch, guest on the podcast, who took Bowen's work and framed it in kind of the integration of sex and couple therapy. And before you talk about your book, which is a great resource, I am curious because you have both the LMFT and your ASEC certified. There's MFTs do this relational healing and we do this work. And a lot of times people think, oh, I need to go to a sex therapist. I'm curious which is more expansive than our topic today. Since you have both certifications, how do you see the fields as both similar and also different?
That's a super interesting question. I do have both. A certified sex therapist is somebody who specializes in sex issues. And you don't have to specialize in sex issues to be effective working with most sex issues. You do have to be able to figure out where your scope of practice starts and stops. And I think that it's very important for every therapist, every counselor, every coach to be at least comfortable and competent working with sex issues. And honestly, I hope you'll have me back to talk about that, because I train therapists to do exactly that, because every single human has a sex issue at one time or another. It might be a sexual identity issue. It might be identity around asexuality. It might be a relational thing. It might be a desire thing. It might be a sexual dysfunction. Who knows? But everybody has a sex issue sooner or later, and probably many times over their lifespan. And it is insane that they can't find a therapist to talk about it. So my first professional mission was to shift that and to train as many therapists as possible to be comfortable, competent, and confident working with sex issues. So I do not think you need to be AASEX certified. I do think you need to know a bunch about sex, and it's not that easy to get accurate information about sex. So you got to get that training somewhere.
You're preaching to the choir. That is how I believe too, in advocating for the field and doing this podcast. But you'd be surprised. I've had some experts on the show that feel a little differently. Before we go, you are a wealth of knowledge, and I can't recommend enough. That's how I first found out about you, Martha, the Polyamory, a clinical toolkit for therapists, and in parentheses, and their clients. Because a lot of times a model or a way of working, there is a book written for the general public, the population, and for the therapist. And this one, though, because there is such a dearth of knowledge of working with this, you write in such an accessible way. It does really work for both. So I'm probably curious. You probably started writing for one population, and then you're like, hey, both people need this. So it's a 2-in-1. You could use this yourself if you're in our audience, and you could give it to your clients, and you'll learn a lot. Certainly, you talk about the book and anything else as far as how our listeners can learn more about working with these couples.
Oh, sure. I did write that book first for clinicians, and then I was putting together those 25 worksheets. And I thought, why wouldn't this be a self-help manual? What about somebody who doesn't have access to services? What about somebody who can't afford a therapist? What about somebody who can't find a therapist who's polyamory informed? There still are huge expanses of the world where you can't find a therapist who doesn't marginalize polyamory or pathologize it. So I did a rewrite to make sure that it was accessible to both audiences. You're exactly right about how I did that. And I intended the book to be really an in-depth primer. The book I had liked best previously had maybe 6 different little checklists about conversations that probably you should talk about if you're thinking about opening up. And I thought, it's just not enough. I didn't have anything to send my clients to. So I wrote the book that I wanted my clients to read. And I wanted it to talk a lot about differentiation. And I wanted it to talk about a lot of the circumstances that therapists think can't be dealt with or don't happen. So in my book, you'll find a whole bunch about the importance of making a good repair, how to transition from multiple infidelity to polyamory. That comes up all the time. And if you can't even conceptualize that, then my book is the only one that you'll find that even talks about it. How to work with a monopoly split. So when one partner wants to open up and the other doesn't want to open up, how do we start to think about that? How do we start to work with it? How do we put this all in a frame that takes into account attachment, differentiation, and also neuroscience? It's definitely a robust textbook, but it's very much written by me in the language that I use. It sounds just exactly like this probably. And that's because that's how I talk to my clients, who are a very smart bunch. And I just figured that's who I'm writing for. I'm writing for the therapists I train and the clients I work with, and it's all the same language. So everybody should just read the book. That's how I wrote it.
Quickly, before we go, talk about the Institute for Relational Intimacy.
That's my training organization headed up by me. And I have a really robust course in working with sex issues for therapists. It runs once a year, starting in early March, usually. I have a pre-recorded CNM1 course that's kind of weekend bingeable, working with consensual non-monogamies. And in both of those cases, I have a level 2 that's consulting groups where people can consult with me about their cases to integrate their learning and to get support with their clinical challenges. And then I've got a whole bunch of free stuff, and I've got lots of training opportunities.
Eli back with you, bringing to a close another successful installment of the AAMFT podcast, where we strive to relate, educate, and innovate one episode at a time. Truly an MFT innovator in working with polyamorous family constellations. Martha, thank you so much. Again, I want to put in another plug for the Institute of Relational Intimacy. You will see Martha's great on-demand training for consensual non-monogamy. There's her level 1 course called Consensual Non-Monogamy, Clinical Skills and Intervention. It's 15 hours worth of pre-recorded lessons with written transcripts if you need those as well when you're an online on-demand learner. And you'll get a slate of essential therapeutic interventions with great written resources, including a relationship repair handbook for recovering from broken agreements and a step-by-step guide for partners in the early stages of opening up their relationship, and more. And there's even level 2, consensual non-monogamy, clinical application, and that is a deep dive consulting group where you join a consulting group to gain support as you grow your clinical skills working with consensual non-monogamy in that therapeutic setting. You receive individualized attention in a small group format. Thank you so much, Martha. You can get a hold of me, Eli, at NorthstarCounselingCenter.com. You can also go to elikaram.com. That's ELIKARAM.com, where you can see my latest trainings on demand in things like preparing for the National Licensure Exam and common factors, focusing on how to enhance client factors, build and repair a therapeutic alliance, everything that goes into ingredients that make therapists effective no matter what model they're practicing. Feel free to drop me a guest or a topic for future installments of the AAMFT podcast as we roll on into our 6th season. As always, value and appreciate your feedback and support. Until next time, my friends, stay safe, stay systemic.